Welcome to the Hollywood Video Podcast. I'm your host, David Wells, and today we're going to talk about two very specific films of the legendary Hayao Miyazaki. This probably will not be the first or the last podcast that we do about Miyazaki, but it'll be the first one. And it's going to focus on a very specific era, his retirement. Now, if you know Hayao Miyazaki, you know that he's announced his retirement several times, only to later go on to make another movie. And what's interesting is he is in his 80s. Let me see. I don't know if he's deep in his 80s. Yeah, he's 84. And he's deep in his 80s. I would say, 84, would that be considered deep? But anyway, as of this podcast, he hasn't announced a new project, but at the same time, people are thinking he could still do something. So we're going to talk about the two movies, each of which he said were definitively the end, that he wasn't going to do any more features. The Wind Rises and The Boy and the Heron, as it's known in the US, or How to Live, as it's known in Japan. And we can't talk about those without mentioning his other attempts at retirement. I don't know if I'm remembering this correctly, but I think the first announcement was Princess Mononoke, and that makes a lot of sense. Because, it's a masterpiece. Just about everything he's done is a masterpiece. Even his first directorial effort. I suppose that's the interesting thing about all his work. All of his movies could, in a sense, be things that you could mark as like the final work and read in this message of like, oh, this means this and this means that. You could read into it and view it as such. Like in an alternate timeline where you rearrange the projects he did in a different year. Say he did Ponyo in 1988 or Princess Mononoke in 2016. I don't know. I guess that just means that they all have a timeless quality. Imagine if he did The Boy and the Heron in, like, say, the 70s. Number one, that's only 30 years after the end of World War II. And rather than it being seen as a culmination, you could view it as the beginning and the template of his movies. I suppose that's what makes a classic. that it could come out in any year, and the context of its time could give it different significance. But anyway, yeah, he's announced multiple times that he's going to retire, and each of the works that he came out with post Mononoke felt like, oh, this could be the one. It felt that way with Spirited Away, Howl's Moving Castle, Ponyo. I can't remember what he did after Ponyo. Oh, maybe it was The Wind Rises. I would have to double check. Yeah, like, it seemed that post Princess Mononoke, slowly there began to be more time between each project. Although arguably, interestingly enough, there was about a 5 year gap between Porco Rosso and Princess Mononoke. I suppose that's because there were. I suppose that's because there were two projects that had some core thing that he wanted to say. So yeah, Spirited Away came out in 2001, Howl's Moving Castle 2004, Ponyo 2008. And then for about and then seven, no, let's see, two, five. Another 5 years, The Wind Rises. And it seemed like The Wind Rises was going to be the last one. Because at the time, Miyazaki was in his 70s. Let's see, if he's 84 now, that means he would have been 72 back then. So I guess what was significant about The Wind Rises is I suppose it felt like he was realizing his own mortality. He was probably well aware of it. Or more, perhaps it's appropriate to say, we, the audience, really became aware of his own mortality. And it was this dawning of like, oh, we're not going to have him forever. And so I guess that's why it was easy for us to believe, like, okay, this really could be the last one. Because people do die in their 60s, and it wouldn't be unheard of. But I suppose it's that thing of he didn't want to get too involved in another project and something happens and he's not able to finish it. That's one thing that happened with anime director Satoshi Kon. But then, wouldn't you know, a couple years later, he comes out with the news like, hey, we're going to do a new movie, The Boy and the Heron. And what makes me believe that The Boy and the Heron could very well be his last picture is the fact that there was a 10-year gap between The Wind Rises and The Boy and the Heron, and he's only getting older. As I'm looking at his filmography, um, the previously the largest time gap between movies he's made was Ponyo and The Wind Rises. But pre Princess Mononoke, the largest gap was The Castle of Cagliostro in 1979 and Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. And he put out movies at a pretty decent rate. You've got to. So we were all expecting The Wind Rises to be the final movie, and quite intentionally, it has this feeling of finality. It and The Boy and the Heron both do. And you could even view The Wind Rises as his last movie. They both simultaneously could be viewed as a farewell of sorts in a way that the other movies don't. The other movies that he announced, oh, I'm going to retire. Perhaps because with The Wind Rises, he was like so insistent, this is the last one. And they even used that in the marketing, the farewell masterpiece. Um, and I think they represent different farewells for different aspects of him. I think The Wind Rises is the farewell from the creator, the artist, and The Boy and the Heron is the farewell from Hayao Miyazaki himself. Because it's not too difficult to look at The Wind Rises and see it is all about a creator. It's all about an artist and his relationship with his creation and trying to have a life. In that movie, it probably mirrors Miyazaki in a way that he, while he might be uncomfortable admitting it, he has enough sincerity that I think he would admit it. Because in the movie, it's about, it's loosely based on the designer of the A6M0, Jiro Horikoshi. And him designing the A6M0, the plane that was used in World War II. This is relevant to Miyazaki because Miyazaki's dad was involved in the Japanese war machine of World War II in the Pacific. So Jiro has this conflict. He loves planes, but he knows that they're going to be used for war efforts. And I guess there's a little bit of Miyazaki in that because he loves making his movies, but at the same time people are going to exploit them for money or whatever he's trying to say is going to get lost and it'll just be viewed as entertainment. Now, some people might say, oh, what else do you expect? People watch movies to be entertained. True, but at the same time, movies can also have a different effect. I remember the movie Harriet the Spy made me want to go out, buy a notebook, and write stuff down. And people, to go to a different Miyazaki film, My Neighbor Totoro was meant to make kids want to explore, go outside, have fun. Miyazaki's intent with that movie was basically to get kids to touch grass, as they say today. And he's had some people say, like, oh, my kids watch that movie so much. And I guess what disappoints Miyazaki is the intent getting lost. Like, it's like, well, I'm happy that they enjoy the movie, but at the same time, I really wanted that movie to inspire a playfulness and disconnect from technology and movies, which are fine, but I feel like people have lost something in the modern era, and I'm trying, by setting it in the post-war era, I'm trying to show them, like, hey, there's something other than just constant stimuli, which we really probably need nowadays. I mean, if he was to come out of retirement again, I could see him doing that. But so I really feel like The Wind Rises is analogous to Hayao Miyazaki, the anime titan. And like so much of the movie does focus on a guy honed in on his craft. There's little bits and pieces of outside the craft, a relationship, and that probably speaks to Miyazaki himself. If you look at, if you delve deep into his life, you'll find out, oh, his wife was also an animator, and that's how they met. And Miyazaki has even said of himself that his wife raised their kids. And Miyazaki, even though he's been critical of his own son's efforts, Goro Miyazaki, in becoming an animator and his efforts, famously, when Miyazaki went to go see the premiere of Tales from Earthsea, he walked out of the theater and he couldn't switch off that part of his brain and be like, oh, it's his kid's movie, go see it for him. Which, you know, in all fairness, his kid is saying, like, oh, I'm an animator too, and it's just like, are you now? And I mean, as harsh as it seems, I get that. But at the same time, Miyazaki has also acknowledged there's this little boy who I owe an apology to and who I wasn't always there for. And that's the same son that he's speaking of. Conversely, his son also designed their headquarters. So you see in The Wind Rises how devoted he was to his craft, how meticulously he was just zeroed in. And if you watch any documentaries, because there are a few about some of his projects, he gets there early and he doesn't leave until late into the night. Even when he was working on The Wind Rises and he was getting up there in age. And it's a remarkable work ethic, and it's astounding that even into his old age he has that much stamina. But even as early as Spirited Away, he has admitted, I don't have the stamina that I used to. I can't take on the same workload. And it's just remarkable to see him go that hard. And The Wind Rises is a beautiful film. And what's interesting is there is some controversy with it. People on both sides of the aisle have attacked the film. People have said, like, oh, it glamorizes Japan's expansion in the Pacific and Asia in the 20th century, which, if you know Miyazaki, that's not his intent. If anything, he's such an anti-war guy. And conversely, people who are like the ultra nationalists in Japan, they say, oh, he's attacking Japan. So he's getting it from both sides. But I feel like people in general have like enjoyed the movie and seen it as people get put in complex situations. I know that for the longest time, Miyazaki was at odds with his dad, like, how could you profit from this war? I think he finally reconciled and, like, with his dad. But I guess The Wind Rises is another example of him trying to work stuff out. Interestingly enough, the culmination of The Wind Rises is there's one bit of deviation from his life in the movie and from what happened to the real Jiro Horikoshi. In the movie, Jiro's wife goes to a sanatorium so that Jiro can just focus on his work. That didn't happen to the real, and she basically goes there to die and not distract him. In the real Jiro Horikoshi, that never happened with his wife, and it didn't happen with Miyazaki either. There was one scene, though, to go back on the anti-war stuff, there was something interesting. He purportedly, there was a scene that he did not get to animate and film in which he wanted to show the A6M0s in a dogfight, and he wanted to illustrate that as, I think, the futility of war, and like, this is brutal, and it was going to be the culmination of Jiro's creations not being allowed to just be beautiful machines and being turned into weapons of death. And what we get in the end of the movie is he's in the fantasy land and he sees the ruins of his planes, and he says not a single one of them returned. And then he sees some of his planes flying in the sky, and you get the feeling it's like basically his dream dying and saying farewell to itself. And there's a poignancy to that. And then, of course, he sees his wife, and before she fades away, she tells him to live. And who knows what effect that had on Miyazaki. You almost have to wonder if his character telling him to live, if that spurred him on to the next movie. Interestingly enough, what really would have made this a fitting end for Miyazaki's theatrical career is the main character, and this is probably no surprise, but was voiced by Hideaki Anno, who has had a long collaboration with Miyazaki. They first became acquainted when Ano responded to an ad looking for needing to hire help for Nausicaa back in the 80s. Excuse me. So he responds to that. He does a storyboard, shows Miyazaki. Miyazaki's impressed and hired him to animate a scene that is like the climax of the film. And if you look at that scene, it's when the God Warrior is firing like this destructive laser blast at this army of giant insects called Ohm. It echoes a lot of stuff that Ano will pursue in his own work. And so that was really, it was the start of Studio Ghibli and so close to the start of Miyazaki's own theatrical animated career that this was a nice sort of bookend to involve Ano in that. And by all accounts, it seemed like that was going to be it. I remember watching The Wind Rises, and when it got to the end, I'm like, bravo, well done. And I'm like, I knew that Miyazaki was still alive because on the day that he does die, that's going to be a huge deal. Like the death of Stanley, death of Akira Toriyama. When it does happen, it's going to hang in the air for a bit. So that was supposed to be the final one. Now, there were some little side projects that he was doing or purportedly involved with. There was a movie called, I think, Boro the Caterpillar that he had ideas for doing. I think back in the 90s, he was going to do either a feature film of Boro the Caterpillar or Princess Mononoke. And his producer, Toshio Suzuki, said, "You're just on the cusp of having the sort of stamina and resilience you need in order to do a movie like Princess Mononoke. So you might not get another chance to do something like it. So I think you should focus on that one." And thanks to Suzuki, we got Princess Mononoke back when we did. So thank you. But I don't ever really remember anything ever coming about with Boro the Caterpillar. I think it was reimagined as a short and it played at the Miyazaki, or no, not the Miyazaki, the Studio Ghibli Museum. And I think I remember hearing about other projects, but nothing as prominent as that. And about a couple years after The Wind Rises, we begin to hear rumors of a new project. And everybody thought, big shocker. But we were at the same time shocked because we thought, well, man, they really hyped up The Wind Rises as the final Miyazaki theatrical film. And it really felt like it. But again, we heard, he said, like, no, I've got another idea. And I'm thinking, like, on the one hand, I'm happy that we get another Miyazaki film. But on the other, it's like, Wind Rises was such a good note to go out on. So, yeah. And one of the reasons why I feel that The Boy and the Heron is going to be the last Miyazaki film, I'll get into the movie itself. One of the reasons I think that it'll be the last one is they really made a huge effort to raise capital for it. They really tried to make sure that this was hand drawn, that there was no CG, because in Mononoke and Spirited Away, Miyazaki experimented a bit with CG, and his son even directed a fully CG movie that tried to move the Ghibli aesthetic to from the realms of pen and paper to pixels. And yeah, so it's funny, Miyazaki went from embracing technology to sort of taking a back step, which he's able to do masterfully. And because he really wanted to do it on his terms, they they did things that seemed unusual for them. Famously, you could not find Ghibli stuff on streaming platforms for a while. Like it was almost impossible. The sole exception was, I think, the first time that you could stream a movie, quote unquote, was on YouTube Movies. You could buy or rent Ghibli films, but even that didn't feel like sort of like a cave, like them caving. I suppose at first, but they were absolutely adamant that no, you're not going to see the movies on Netflix or Hulu or anywhere else. I think maybe Kiki's Delivery Service was like the only one, but I think there was like some kind of exception. But that started to change. We started to hear that, I think this was just before COVID, like, oh, Studio Ghibli movies, they're going to be on Netflix in the UK, HBO Max in the US, and they were really raising funds in whatever way they could. And Miyazaki wanted to be involved in the making of process. He didn't want to delegate so much away that could he really say it was his movie. And it was at this point where he said something like a scene that, I forget the exact quote, but a scene that could have taken me a couple of days now takes me like a month to animate. So yeah, I mean, this movie, there's no flaw in the animation, and I guess he's just trying that hard. So I've said that the Wind Rises was the Wind Rises was his farewell as Miyazaki, the auteur, the director, the creator. I feel like The Boy and the Heron is the farewell to the little boy that would grow up to be the creator. Miyazaki has even said he made this movie for his grandson so that he has something to remember when his grandpa is gone. So the movie, so like The Wind Rises, this movie takes place in, at least the opening does, in World War II. It opens in World War II, in the final days of World War II, and begins to pick up in like the post-war era. There's this interesting clip of Miyazaki from the documentary Kingdom of Madness, where he's on the garden rooftop of Studio Ghibli and he says, "Oh, it's all going to fall apart and go away. There's no denying that. But what can you do? And he's oddly at peace with that. So, like, it's interesting. Now, I saw The Boy and the Heron with family and friends, and they thought it was interesting. Like, if you don't know a lot about Miyazaki, you might be a bit confused or overwhelmed with, like, sort of the whimsy. But I went in there and, like, oh, the parakeets are people and they're so easily stirred towards action. They can be so riled up. And the parakeet king is, you could say that he's the bad guy, and he might be the closest to a straight up bad guy in a Ghibli film since I would say Castle in the Sky. But what's interesting is I think what he shows is how people overreact to when people go through really pressing and harrowing situations, how that opens them up to being manipulated. How I think it's the commentary on, I guess, fascism and militarism that allowed the Axis powers to convince the population that, hey, give us the reins and we'll save you. That's basically how they take over. And it's very easy to read into him as like, oh, he's basically just a certain mustache man, or he's Tojo. But at the same time, I think he's also like the fear and anxiety of people going through remarkably difficult times and what that fear does to someone. And that's what culminates in the climax of the movie. I'll get to that in a second. The whole movie is, in this movie, this boy, Mahito, he loses his mother in the fire bombings of World War II, and then his dad gets remarried and sets up a new life. He marries his mom's sister, and one day his stepmom, she disappears, and he has to go and find her, and he goes into another world, and he's helped by this heron that guides him to the next world. It's the land of the dead. So in this land, he comes across all these different characters. One of them being this old man who turns out to be his uncle from years ago. And you get a feeling that this old man is sort of an analogy for the Miyazaki himself coming to the end, and the world he's created in this movie is basically Studio Ghibli and the imagination and the ability to create. And there's a lot to think about, I suppose. Like how the origin of this world is a meteor struck and the uncle saw it, and then he wound up going to another world. And it's sort of difficult to say what it means. I'm sure we've all got our theories, and Miyazaki would scoff at a lot of them. He might even just say, oh, it's just fantasy, nothing meant to be read into. But it kind of feels like, where does artistic inspiration come from? Comes from out of nowhere, and we don't know. Why do people make stuff? Why do people make the art that they make? What does it mean? And it's ironic that I'm saying what I think it means, and but we can just say, I don't know. Like, why do you like the stuff you like? I don't know. I just do. And they never they never go into so much detail with the meteorite that somehow is magic and somehow enabled the uncle to create what he created. And in the movie, Mahito, the main character, he comes across a younger version of his mom who helps him along. And because she's the sister of the dad's new wife, she has a vested interest in making sure that she's found and she's safe. And I think it sends this message of, like, the stepmother in this movie represents when he decides to rescue her and save her. It's this embracing the future and embracing change, and seeing his mom off in this world is like appreciating the past and not being bound to it. And this message of appreciating the past but not being bound to it and moving on with the forward, it culminates in, towards the end, the old man, the uncle, he has this block puzzle that he says, if you solve this, if you can make it stable, this world can be saved. And Mahito, he tries to figure out, and he may have figured it out, but then the Parakeet King, he comes up, and he hastily, just without thinking, tries to set up the puzzle, and it crumbles. And then the world begins to crumble. And it kind of feels like Miyazaki is saying, like, there's going to be a time when you can't imagine or create. And yeah, you just have to accept that. And so that whole world comes to an end. Mahito rescues his stepmom, and he moves on with life. And for all of Miyazaki's talk of, like, oh, Studio Ghibli is going to come to an end and it's all going to fall apart, what can you do about it? Part of me has to question how much he believes that, because the heron, he survives, and he says to the boy, you and I aren't friends or allies. But even he seems to sort of question that by the end of the movie, because of all the characters from this movie, all the imaginative, fantastic ones, he's like sort of the sole survivor of that. And at the end of the movie, him and Mahito part ways, and even though he said they're not friends or allies, you get the sense that maybe he wonders, well, how true is that? So it makes you think that for all the indifference Miyazaki has towards his own work and his own legend and his own legacy, how convinced is he really that that's the case? And the movie ends with Mahito leaving his house, and we cut to the credits. And unlike a lot of Miyazaki films, there's a pop song playing in the credits, which apparently he actually liked. And I think it's as simple as, like, oh, he just liked the song. But of course, it's something he never does. So maybe thought, okay, if this is going to be the last one, let's do something different. And so one of the things I remember the movie was described as a tool to heal our collective souls, which this is maybe the second year in the post-COVID era. And even in 2021, things were feeling very like things returned to normal startlingly quick. I mean, I live in Texas, so things got really normal even in 2020. The thing about The Boy and the Heron is they took they did almost no advertising in Japan except for a poster. They didn't tell people much about what the movie was about. And Miyazaki said this echoed his movie going experience when he was a kid, where all they had to go off was there's a poster at the theater, and whichever one was most intriguing that caught their eye, they'd go and see that one without even knowing a whole bunch about it. And that worked in Japan. Now, they knew that they had to take a different route in the US. Famously, Miyazaki film or anime films in the US don't pull the same numbers as they do in Japan. And I kind of feel like that was a lot of the films that sort of millennials and Gen Z, they were sort of the first US audience exposed to that. And now that they're grown up, I think that changed things for The Boy and the Heron because it was like their most profitable movie in North America. It did surprisingly well. And I think for the future of anime films in the US, like its box office, I think its global box office was 294 million. So just short of 300 million. Let's see. I'm looking up the statistics.
Well, which is cases it and line prospect.
So anyway, yes, as far as we know, The Boy and the Heron is Miyazaki's final film. And in between the release of the film, in between its inception and its release, he lost his longtime collaborator, Isao Takahata, who had been with him from the beginning, who was like one of the first people to say, like, hey, he's talented. Let's give him more to do. And one of the few times that we've seen Miyazaki cry in public was at Isao Takahata's funeral, and he affectionately referred to him by his nickname. And it was a sobering thought, I think, for Miyazaki that he realized things really are coming to the end. And some of the people who I wanted to be with me, they're not here. But at the same time, ever since the release of The Boy and the Heron, there have been rumors that, oh, Miyazaki is up to something else. And we don't know how true that is because, again, The Boy and the Heron took about 10 years to develop and to make. And it feels like a fitting end. I know some people Some people thought it was weird. That could simply be because it's if it is his last film, then he put everything into it that he wanted to say. So, who knows? My personal opinion is it's mixed. I think, on the one hand, this really could be the last one for the reasons I've given. But on the other hand, you gotta wonder if he's 84 years old now. I think he had just entered his 80s, or had been in his 80s for a little bit when the movie released. You've gotta wonder, is making movies keeping him alive? Maybe he doesn't go until he really decides to stop. But anyway, both movies feel like a fitting end for him. And I guess perhaps we would love for him to live forever so he could keep making movies. But I'm not even sure that he would want that, given his own life philosophy. I'm sure even if Miyazaki was immortal, which in a way the enduring popularity of his movies in a way do make him immortal, even if, you know, somehow he got a special deal and got to live forever, there really would be a time where he would stop making movies and say, I'm done. I think I'll take a break. And that's fine. If it really is the last one he made, thank you for all your years of service and creativity and putting a bit of magic into this world. And I guess I'll end this video on, there's a really cute moment from the documentary, I think it's called Kingdom of Dreams and Madness, where Miyazaki has this little house that he goes to kind of, I guess, decompress and unwind. And this little girl just happens to walk by the house, and she knows who he is, and she bows and says, thank you for making the Howl's movie, referring to Howl's Moving Castle. And he says, you're welcome. And then he turns and walks back, and you hear him chuckle. So, for all his sort of, in some ways, he's kind of like the anti-Stanley, where like, Stanley is like, hey, I made Spider-Man and Excelsior. He's kind of like, he's sort of the opposite, but that's so much of his time. And like, if you take all the circumstances, the cultural, the time he grew up, I guess Miyazaki is happy that people appreciate his work, but he also wants people to live their own lives and aspire to make their own stuff, which is respectable. So I guess to echo that little girl's sentiments, thank you for making the Howl's movie. And this has been another episode of the Hollywood Video Podcast. Go and watch a movie. Not necessarily an internet video, but watch like a real movie. Whether it's a traditional narrative structure or something experimental. Have an absolutely wonderful day. Goodbye.